Due Process, recipient of 6 Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards.
Yeah, I got word then that I was going home 10 years, 3 months, and 8 days after my arrest.
On death row in Arizona until DNA freed him, now a voice for ending executions. Capital punishment under new scrutiny, as well-publicized errors raise new doubts. That's next on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual.
It is one of those issues that continues to divide us. Are we for it or against it? Either way, it's a life or death matter. I'm Raymond Brown. We're talking today about capital punishment. Of course, we've been debating it for decades, since before it was struck down more than 30 years ago, since after it was restored here in New Jersey more than 20 years ago. And the debate continues here in the studio as a law professor tells us why we need it, a state senator argues for ending it, and a pollster reports on the changing public opinion. But first, here's Sandy King to bring us up to date on what's happening with the death penalty here in New Jersey.
And Raymond, there's been lots happening here in just the last few months. First, the legislature overwhelmingly passed a bill to mount an official study. Then the governor vetoed it. But not long after, the state Senate renewed its effort to force a study. And now a Senate bill's been introduced that would once again make executions here illegal, that would put an end to death row, New Jersey.
To say I'm happy to be here is an understatement. I'm overjoyed. I'm fortunate. I'm very blessed.
Blessed because Ray Crone can remember what it's like to be on death row.
I was sentenced to death. I was chained up, bound like Houdini in one of his escape routines, put in a van and hauled off to death row in Arizona.
But death row Arizona was not so different from death row Trenton, a place where a tiny fraction of those convicted of murder are warehoused for years, awaiting execution.
There's a lot more people left behind inside that may not ever have the chance to prove their innocence like I did. It took 10 years, a lot of my family's money and time.
And unlike the 13 on death row here and the thousands more on death lockups around the country, Ray Crone did get out, cleared by DNA evidence after more than a decade.
And here was the government, the prosecution, not interested in finding the truth about my brother's mental illness. They simply wanted to strengthen their case so that they could put him to death.
And what Ray Crone knows about being on death row, this man knows about being afraid that your brother will end up there. The brother you turned in.
We suspected that a loved one, a family member, was committing terrible crimes.
That brother, the dreaded Unabomber Ted Kaczynski. It was David who led authorities to him 8 years ago to stop the bombings and the carnage.
We understood that if we did nothing, some innocent person somewhere might pick up a package and get blown to bits.
Believing that the government, in return, would not seek execution.
Knowing that the suspect was mentally ill, I kind of felt we had an understanding. The agents were very clear to me that they believed that the Unabomber was mentally ill. They told me he could get treatment in prison. There was no talk about the death penalty.
But federal prosecutors did initially seek the death penalty, despite those understandings with the Kaczynskis.
I think what bothers me the most is that we have tremendous political pressure, particularly in a high-profile case, to put the person to death. And when there's that kind of political pressure, truth, justice, wisdom, objectivity, all of it flies out the window.
And few cases were more high-profile than the Unabomber. It was only a plea deal and a high-priced lawyer that kept Ted Kaczynski off of federal death row.
And I'm so happy that the justice system finally gave my brother a life sentence and not a death sentence.
It also gave David Kaczynski a cause, an end to capital punishment, one he shares with Ray Crone and with some people who've seen the death penalty from some very different angles.
Today we know that over 112 death inmates awaiting execution have been found to be actually innocent of the crimes of which they were convicted.
There's the retired federal appeals judge and the former state Supreme Court justice.
Where we cannot, as a matter of decency, really abide or tolerate a regime where we are putting people to death.
And there's even the one-time U.S. Attorney and State Attorney General, whose job it once was to prosecute death cases.
Assuredly, it makes good sense to impose a moratorium in New Jersey and to have a study that addresses a lot of these questions and comes to a conclusion and making recommendations as to whether it should be continued.
But while the pollsters tell us that support for executions has dropped, capital punishment still has plenty of defenders.
Eventually, you throw up your hands and you say, what else can we do?
And though there was a fight by groups like this one, the moratorium failed. But hopes for the study are still alive, renewed by the state Senate, despite the governor's veto.
There's no reason why New Jersey should lag behind jurisdictions like Illinois in terms of thinking hard about these issues, looking at the data, thinking about whether the execution of innocent people is really a possibility, and taking appropriate action.
It would not be the first official panel to take on the death penalty. The last was just 6 years ago. But that commission's charge was to speed up the long process from conviction to lethal injection.
10 or 12 or 15 or 18 years.
While this one would be asking a different set of questions.
Mistakes can be made. We're at a stage now, particularly in the Northeast, before anyone has been executed, where we can go ahead and look at the law and make sure that the ultimate tragedy doesn't occur.
But that ultimate penalty is, for the moment at least, on hold by judicial order. Now, the state's highest court has ruled that the death penalty here is legal, that it is not cruel and unusual. But in February, an appellate court ruled that there were problems of the procedural kind, problems with the regulations that govern executions, from limitations on free speech of those about to die to the way that lethal injection would be used to kill them. It's a ruling not likely to derail executions indefinitely, just until the regs could be rewritten. Death penalty proponents say it's just one more in a list of long delays. True, there are 14 on death row, Trenton, but there's been no execution here since capital punishment came back to New Jersey, and Raymond, that has been 22 years.
Will there ever be an execution here? Should there be? Those questions and more when we come back, so stay with us.
Well, I think that any civilized society should not have the death penalty.
That's too much of an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth.
I do believe in the death penalty. Under certain situations, certain charges, it all depends on the nature of the crime.
Especially if they murder children.
Some of the horrific things that people do to other people, yes, it's warranted.
It's needed, you know, for this nonsense out there. They're just taking lives at random.
If you're insane enough to kill someone, you deserve treatment rather than death.
People who commit crimes are irrational. Why should they think about the consequence of death?
Except there are certain circumstances where the crimes are so horrible, I guess there's no alternative. I'd prefer never to have to do it.
On capital punishment, almost everyone has an opinion. And as we just saw, it tends to be divided. But is the balance of opinion changing? State Senator Robert Martin's come to give us his argument for abolishing the ultimate penalty. But New York Law School professor Robert Blecker says don't throw out the penalty. Instead, he says save it for the most egregious cases. And with us from Newark, Patrick Murray of the Star-Ledger-Eagleton poll is here to tell us what the numbers say. Welcome, everyone. Senator Martin, I've got to start with you. You've introduced a bill, and there's a companion bill in the Assembly, to abolish the death penalty. Now, is that a symbolic act of principle, or do you have a realistic chance of passing such legislation and overriding the governor's anticipated veto?
That's a matter of debate. I did, with the co-sponsor, Senator Ray Lesniak of Union County, Democrat, we talked about whether this was feasible. We don't think it's immediately feasible, but we want to get it out there. We want the debate to rise, and hopefully, if the very least, we may get a moratorium, which is something we advocated last year. But we really want to get to. We decided we'd put into a bill what we really want to see happen.
So you want a prompt debate and ask for more and settle for a little less?
Well, I'm not ready to settle, but in the legislative process, we think that this issue is so sort of fundamentally important that we will listen to all comers and see where it goes.
Okay. Professor Blecker, you're a death penalty proponent with finely tuned and well thought out arguments. You don't argue deterrence. You concede that there are problems of innocence. Yet, I suspect if you were in the New Jersey legislature, you'd vote against the senator's bill. If so, why?
Well, first of all, I appreciate his candor, because often those who are pushing for a moratorium claim that they're using this occasion in order to improve the death penalty and then decide later whether to abolish it. And many of us who have been proponents of it have insisted that those who push for moratoria are really people who want to abolish it. So he's confessing to that. Would I be against abolishing it? Yes, because some people kill so callously, so cruelly, so wantonly that they simply deserve to die, and society has the obligation to execute them. It's a moral obligation.
Legal scholars use the term retribution to describe that position. What does society specifically gain from that?
You see, to even ask the question is to deny the premise, because when you ask what do they gain, you're talking in a utilitarian mode. That is, you're asking what are the future benefits? What is the future? The retributivist focuses upon the past, not the future. The future-oriented people say you can't cry over spilt blood. I mean, the past is the past, and the only question is what can we do about it in the future. But for us, it's different, and it's part of the core of Western culture to be connected to the past, to be deeply connected to the past, that the past cries out.
Given Robert's view, it would seem to me, Senator, that if people are anchored who are death penalty proponents in a deeply held moral view about the value of retribution, is there any way to persuade, to change points of view, and therefore what would be the point of having a bill that prompts discourse?
Well, there's really, I think, two issues that have driven this bill. One is the moral issue, where I think we could well differ and perhaps take a different view as to where Western civilization has sort of brought us, and I'm of a Christian tradition, which may influence certainly where I am on that. But there's some important factors in New Jersey. We have had, as noted, a bill on the books since 1982, and the more I've looked at that legislation existing and how it's been attempted to be implemented, I've come to the conclusion that at least in New Jersey, with our criminal justice system, that we probably can't get it right in terms of who would be eligible for the death penalty.
Eligibility is a point I want to get to, but let me bring Patrick Murray in for just a minute, because it seems to me that you have Senator Martin, who's sometimes been called a maverick, but is a skilled politician, saying ultimately down the road he thinks he can get a bill passed, and yet certainly a strong part of the political culture in this state is kind of a ritualistic agreement of the majority with the death penalty. What do the people think?
Well, at the gut level, that they feel that the death penalty is something that's necessary in terms of having a punishment that fits the crime. But the more that we present options to people and start talking about the death penalty, we see that positions and opinions start to shift. For example, when you present a position of, well, how about life in prison without a chance of parole, then people's opinions start to move. They start to think, well, that is a punishment that fits the crime. People's support for the death penalty has been decreasing exponentially over the past 20 years. I think from the high 70s down to below 60% today.
Sounds like you're telling us that people actually think in a pretty nuanced way about this. Can you give us any numbers about where the hardcore support is and where the numbers fall off to when you give other options?
Yeah, I think hardcore support for the death penalty is probably around 30%. Right now, the most recent numbers that we have show that just below 6 in 10 people support the death penalty at a gut level. But when we start presenting options, that drops precipitously to below 30%. And that number has been, or the number for opposition against the death penalty has been increasing, particularly in the past 5 years.
Well, now that we recognize that at least the public is beginning to think in more nuanced terms, let me come back to you, Robert, and move a little bit away from the moral foundation or the policy argument and look at the question that really has bedeviled the Supreme Court since Furman and Gregg, since it overturned the death penalty and then reinstated it, which is how do you in some systemic way narrow the class of people? Is there a practical way to do that? Given especially the kind of sometimes raucous and irresponsible debate, I think you would say on both sides, that takes place in the public and maybe even in some legislatures.
Yes, there is. It should be confined only to the worst of the worst. Now, of course, the next question is, who are the worst of the worst?
Yeah, how do we decide?
And how do you do that? Well, there's a core of Western tradition that has focused on what constitutes the worst of the worst. I mean, Aristotle talked about it, and it's cruelty. And the essence of cruelty at the extreme is either the taking pleasure in another person's suffering or the depraved and wanton indifference, the callousness, the coldness, at the extremes. Now, there are going to be boundary cases, and I can't tell you necessarily when day becomes night because we have twilight, but I can tell you that 12 noon is day and midnight is night. So I can give you, sure.
Can you give us an example? Give us an example of a case that you think clearly falls in the category of those cases that are egregious and should warrant execution.
Can give you three quickly. Danny Rawling, the ninja killer, the Gainesville massacre, who stalked co-eds from the University of Florida, broke into their apartments, then duct taped them and raped them and stabbed them repeatedly. In 2 cases, he cut off their nipples and put them in a baggie.
Let me just stop with that one. Senator Martin, how do you respond to that? Why is that not a case for which death is an appropriate punishment?
The strongest case, I think, is to identify the worst heinous crime imaginable. And I'd be sort of hard-pressed to seriously argue, perhaps, that maybe that particular person does deserve or does not deserve the death penalty. What we found in New Jersey, however, is that in those cases where the courts have decided and justice has identified who should get the death penalty, it's been very scattered, arbitrary. Only a small percentage of persons have been so selected. And there's also a disturbing pattern called the white victims effect, which has been identified by a study of the courts to show that in some, particularly in counties that have a disproportionate amount of white folks, that when somebody gets sentenced to the death penalty, it's typical, or is convicted and receives the death penalty, it's typically because they have murdered a white person. And so you got really questions about who will be selected, and and we can point to a couple, perhaps well-published.
Let's come back to Professor Blecker, because it seems to me that part of the heart of this is that even though the Supreme Court, since McCleskey, has declined to get involved in at least some part of the dialogue about race, clearly race and class are viewed by much of the public and by many courts as a disturbing aspect of the issue of who gets executed. And you have also been a very sharp and interesting critic of a lack of candor on both sides in the discussion about the death penalty. How do you get through to the legislature and then refine a system that prevents those kinds of problems, i.e. race, class, and other improper considerations, and still segregates out these worst cases you talk about?
I'm delighted you asked that. Let's look at race for a minute, because it's worth looking at, because there's a common misperception. The essential question of race, of course, would be, all other things equal, does a black defendant stand a greater likelihood of being executed than a white defendant? Since 1990, there have been 18 studies, all 18 out of 18, most of which have been conducted by abolitionists, including David Baldus, who is the leading expert on this. All 18 studies have shown that there is no race of defendant effect. If there is at all, it is that a black defendant is slightly less likely to be executed than a white defendant. So then the debate shifted from the race of the defendant to the race of the victim. And the claim now by the abolitionists is to say, look, as was just said, where the victim is white, it is more likely that the person will be executed, the killer will be executed, than where the victim is black. And then that's used to say, we are a society, therefore, that is cheapening black life. We only care about white life. But the more recent studies have exploded that one too, including the leading study by Judge Boehm in New Jersey itself. What that study shows is that what the race of victim effect has nothing to do with how we value the life of victims. What it has to do with is geography. In those jurisdictions, in the suburban counties, which are largely white, the prosecutors who make the decision whether to prosecute more likely go for the death penalty, not because it's white or black, but because their constituents tend to support it. In the urban counties, which are poorer and which are more heavily minority, the prosecutors tend not to go for the death penalty.
Let me give Senator Martin a chance to respond, because then I want to go back out and see whether the public thinks about the question of race. Senator?
Well, the professor is right in the sense that this most recent study by former Superior Court Judge Boehm did say that geography was probably the leading reason why some counties seem to pursue the death penalty more actively. But it also seems to be tied, at least to a certain degree, with race. But even if it isn't, the concern is generally one of procedure. Who is the person to be selected? Should it be based upon a county? I think we know that New Jersey's county prosecutors generally have free rein in their counties, and is it fair in a system of justice where you have the ultimate penalty to have different standards in Morris, where I live, and Essex, where I work?
The issue of arbitrariness, Patrick Murray, is one that lawyers have worried about with respect to the death penalty really for 30 years intensely, including at the highest level. But on the question of race, which our other guests have talked about, is there any sign that the public, when it thinks about the death penalty, is focused on or concerned about either the defendant race question or the victim race question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is at the core of why we've seen support for the death penalty decreasing over the past few years. Two-thirds of New Jerseyans feel that the death penalty is applied unequally according to race. 70% feel it's applied unequally according to income. Poor people are more likely to be put to death. Very few people feel that it's a deterrent against crime, so that there is that sense that it is an arbitrarily determined punishment.
May I comment on that for a second?
Sure.
Because that's the uninformed view. I mean, if the public were aware of what the fact is, we mentioned the study. The study says, and I quote, "The race of the victim had no impact on whether the defendant was sentenced to death."
But that's one study in a subject that's been controversial for some time. I want to make sure we get to another point. Let me do this. Senator Martin, also a professor, is the innocence question relevant to what I suspect you feel is a change in public sentiment about the death penalty?
Well, of course it's relevant. It would be scary. New Jersey, I think, in the last few years has identified 16 people who convicted of murder and rape who were not, through DNA and some other ways of identifying, were not really guilty. We do make mistakes. This, of course, would be the ultimate mistake. I think if we would shift to something much more certain, which is life without the possibility of being released, would be fair for all concerned.
Yeah, I don't want to caricature you as somebody who says it's okay to execute the innocent, but do you concede that it's inevitable some innocent people will or may be executed, and if so, is that an acceptable price?
Well, first of all, notice we're told that there have been errors in murder convictions. No one is claiming that there's anybody on New Jersey's death row who's factually innocent. Nobody that I know who's responsible is claiming it. Secondly, the polling...
Some of the DNA evidence that Barry Scheck and others have done suggested there are certainly people who've been on death row and but for a scientific piece of evidence would have been executed.
Correct, but as your graphic said earlier, more than 900 people have been executed in the modern era, and even the abolitionists do not claim to be able to prove that there is even one innocent person who has ever been executed.
Is it a risk?
Yes, it is a risk.
And is it an acceptable risk?
And my guess is there probably has been one who have been executed.
Patrick, yeah, there's an interesting...
What does the public think about that?
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting part of the public opinion, is that the public does agree with that premise, that innocent people are put to are put on death row, at least, if not put to death.
As we wind down, I'm sorry to cut you off.
Sure.
I got to give you 15 seconds. Is there going to be the end of the death penalty in New Jersey and the U.S. within 10, 15 years?
I think it'll be in New Jersey, if not by the legislature, by the courts.
Does it have a long life in New Jersey and in the United States, in your view?
It not only has a long life in the United States, but it has a long life in the world. I expect the death penalty to return to Europe.
That's a subject for another whole show, because certainly it's powerfully important in international law. Thank you all. That's it for this edition of Due Process. But we know you'll want to be back here next week when, once again, we take on a tough issue of law and justice. Till then, for Sandy King and all of us here at Due Process, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching.
Some moral facts, and principle among them is that some people deserve to die, and society has an obligation to execute them. That is, there are some people who kill so coldly, so callously, so wantonly, so cruelly, that they simply have forfeited their right to life, and that we have the obligation to take that life.
The question is not who deserves to live, but rather when can the state, acting on behalf of you and me, terminate God's gift to another person? The answer to that question cannot, I suggest, be that the state can do so in order to fulfill the atavistic desires of some among us for what is in fact vengeance.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual,